Well, hello everyone. Thanks for coming to my presentation. I'm Steve Allen, Dr. Stephen J. Allen. If you want to be formal, I recently retired as the Vice President and Chief Investigative Officer at the Capitol Research Center in Washington. I am now Distinguished Senior Fellow, which is something like Professor Emeritus, I think, which is basically if you're a Professor Emeritus, used to be a professor and now you're looking for work. So that's kind of where I am. So I'm available. Weddings, bar mitzvahs, whatever you need me for, I'm available. This is a rough time to talk about political issues, including here. I was at the AG in 2017 and we had Roger Stone as a speaker who was one of President Trump's mentors. And then there was another speaker who was a scientist who said that anybody who voted for Trump had something wrong with their brains. And the interesting thing is that both of those speakers were treated well and respected. I think things have gotten so heated. I was talking to some folks about some of this material today, and I think they got mad, angry. So this may be my last controversial speech at a MENSA thing, but I thank you for coming, and I hope you'll be able to come up with some good questions, at the end. And please tolerate me for being a heathen or whatever I am. I live in D.C. I vote down the street from my apartment. It's where Hillary's church is. Robots have been known to roam the neighborhood. That's real. And on the street outside my apartment, I saw a vulture eating a rat. So the big question for me is, which of these things is most symbolic of Washington? I don't know. But here's my talk on 8 days in May. In 8 days in 2017, May 9th to May 17th, we went from the firing of an FBI director to the appointment of a special counsel who was assigned to determine, among other things, if the President of the United States was a traitor. At one point, FBI officials discussed how they might overthrow the President. It was the culmination of an effort in which one of the officials at that meeting had vowed that Trump would never become president because, quote, we'll stop him, unquote. More about that later. Scott Pelley of 60 Minutes would call this period 8 days in May when all of these things were happening behind the scenes that the American people really didn't know about. And upon hearing of these behind-the-scenes maneuvers, pundits latched onto the term 8 days in May, which is obviously a reference to the 1964 film 7 Days in May, a thriller screenplay by Rod Serling of The Twilight Zone about a planned takeover of the United States government in reaction to the president's negotiation of a disarmament treaty with the Soviet Union. The coup was justified by the characters in the movie on the ground that the president was a Russian dupe. In the movie, it was the military. In real life, it was the Justice Department. Some background. By the time May 2017 rolled around, FBI Director James Comey had two problems. One was Hillary Clinton, and the other was Donald Trump. In the heat of the 2016 campaign, as you probably remember, Comey had announced the decision not to prosecute Clinton for the theft of some 66,000 documents, the destruction of about half those documents, and the exposure of those documents to hostile foreign intelligence services. But he essentially declared her guilty while saying no prosecutor would go after her. And that really fed the idea that Clinton had somehow cheated justice. Then when Donald Trump became president and faced accusations of colluding with the Russians, Comey repeatedly told Trump in private that he wasn't under investigation, but he refused to say so publicly. The president decided to fire Comey, and on May 4th through 7th of 2017, he worked on a letter to that effect, and then on May 8th, the Deputy Attorney General, Rod Rosenstein, learned of the president's intention. Trump asked for his help on the matter, and Rosenstein agreed, writing a memo in which he recommended the firing. He specifically cited the Hillary Clinton botch-up. Attorney General Sessions agreed. Indeed, Sessions and Rosenstein had been considering firing Comey for months. The chain of command is President, Attorney General, Deputy Attorney General, and then FBI Director, so all of Comey's superiors were in agreement on this. May 9th, Comey was fired. The White House said that the firing was based on the clear recommendations of Sessions and Rosenstein. But then, 2 days later, on May 11th, the president told Lester Holt of NBC News that he was thinking of this Russia thing, which is a made-up story, when he decided to fire Comey. But he said he would have fired him nonetheless. The president noted that Comey had refused to say in public what he said in private. Comey later acknowledged that he had told Trump on 3 occasions that he was not personally under investigation. On May 11th, Andrew Mccabe, who at this point is acting director of the FBI, testified before the Senate Intelligence Committee. He agreed to notify the committee of any effort to interfere with the FBI's ongoing investigation into links between Russia and the Trump campaign. There had been, he said, no effort to impede our investigation. And remember, this is after the Comey firing. At the time, Mccabe was, however, actively considering opening an obstruction of justice investigation, so basically he apparently was lying under oath. Around May 15th, Mccabe decided to reestablish contact with Christopher Steele, a former British spy and the author of the famous or infamous Dirty Dossier, claiming that Donald Trump was being blackmailed by the Russians. Steele, at one point in 2016, was working simultaneously for the FBI, the Clinton campaign, and the Russian oligarch Oleg Deripaska, who is Vladimir Putin's buddy. The contact with Steele was through Bruce Orr, a Justice Department official, who had been the Associate Deputy Attorney General in charge of organized crime. Orr's wife, who was former CIA, worked for Fusion GPS, the political operation that hired Steele. That Fusion GPS was working for Perkins Coie, which was the law firm hired by the Clinton campaign. McCabe's decision to reestablish contact with Steele was more than 6 months after Steele had been formally terminated as an FBI source. They didn't trust him. He was deemed unsuitable as a source, but his material had continued to get through to the FBI, often via Bruce Orr. Orr would pass along reports from his wife, but stripped the heading so you couldn't tell that it came from Fusion GPS. I'll explain all of that in a few minutes. On the morning of May 16th, the New York Times published material leaked by Comey. Comey later acknowledged that he had leaked the material by way of a friend, Columbia Law School professor Daniel Richman. Richman was also a Justice Department consultant. Comey was FBI director at the time. He was using FBI equipment and leaking classified information, so this action by Comey was illegal. And the Justice Department's Inspector General, the watchdog, has in fact recommended prosecution, although that was blocked by the Department of Justice. The leak, Comey said, was designed to spur the appointment of a special counsel. Comey related private conversations with Trump in this material. He claimed that on January 27th, the president had told him, "I need loyalty." Comey then responds, "You will always get honesty from me." Again, according to Comey, the president said, "That's what I want, honest loyalty." And Comey said, "You will get that from me." So basically, Trump was demanding, quote, honest loyalty, unquote. Also, the president asked Comey to go easy on former National Security Advisor Michael Flynn, who, under heavy pressure, including threats against his son by the prosecutors, had pled guilty to lying to 2 FBI agents. It should be noted there's no independent evidence that Flynn was lying, and the FBI agents themselves, one of whom was Peter Strzok, the guy who hated Trump, the FBI agents themselves didn't think he was lying to them. The leaked material from Comey appeared May 16th. The same morning, there was a meeting of the Justice Department in which Mccabe pushed for the Trump investigation. Present were Lisa Page, who was McCabe's special counsel, and Rosenstein and a couple of more other aides. There, Mccabe said later, they discussed whether the vice president and a majority of the cabinet could be brought together to remove the president of the United States under the 25th Amendment. McCabe said Rosenstein raised that scenario. Rosenstein denies it. McCabe was later fired for supposedly lying to FBI investigators, so I don't know what exactly happened there. The 25th Amendment, by the way, provides for the transfer of power when a president is unable, that's the term, unable, to perform his duties. Alan Dershowitz, the professor emeritus at Harvard Law School, has called any such attempt a coup d'etat, to try to get rid of the president when he's not actually unable to perform his duties. At that May 16th hearing, Mccabe supposedly suggested that Rosenstein wear a wire to trap the president making incriminating statements. That's one version. The other version has Rosenstein sarcastically asking, "What do you want me to do, Andy? Wire the president?" So again, conflicting ideas of what happened. Later on May 16th, there's a meeting in the Oval Office with Rosenstein and former FBI Director Robert Mueller. The president later said that Mueller was being considered as the replacement for Comey, which Mueller has denied. In any event, Mueller would be a potential witness in an obstruction case, which he has acknowledged. That would bar him, you would think, from being the prosecutor. If he was also a witness. Also, he was a friend of Comey's, in fact, often described in the media as Comey's mentor. Comey was a suspect. There again, a problem. And another problem, Rosenstein would appoint Mueller and supervise Mueller, but Rosenstein had signed one of the fake applications for renewal of a warrant to investigate the Trump campaign, making him potentially a suspect. So Mueller's supervisor is a suspect. Despite all of this, the next day, May 17th, Rosenstein appointed Mueller as special counsel. Mueller would put together a team, and there would be a problem with that. It included originally Lisa Page and Peter Strzok, the two FBI agents. They were having an affair, and in text messages on their FBI devices expressed utter contempt for Donald Trump and a desire to stop him, as they said. Also, there was one lawyer who had represented the Clinton Foundation, another who had represented the fellow who set up the server in Hillary Clinton's basement. Andrew Weissman was on the team, in fact, the head of the team under Mueller, and he was considered a sort of a poster child for prosecutorial misconduct, basically causing the shutdown of Arthur Anderson, the accounting firm, and the loss of tens of thousands of jobs in a case that was completely thrown out when it got to the Supreme Court. Mueller recruited largely from the Justice Department and from his law firm, Wilmer Hale, which was a problem because Justice Department employees gave 97% of their contributions to Hillary Clinton over Donald Trump, and Wilmer Hale employees 99.8% of their contributions to Hillary. Now, the thing is, you say, well, you know, it's not a problem if they do a professional job, but it is a problem, and here's why. The reason you have a special counsel is so that people have confidence in the investigation. So you don't have Attorney General Sessions do it, for example, because, well, he's Trump's appointee and he met with Ambassador Kislyak and so forth. So people would not believe anything he came up with. So therefore you have to have this independent person, a special counsel, and this defeats that entire purpose by having people who are strongly on one side of these issues. 2 days later, May 19th, Peter Strzok sent a text to Lisa Page. Strzok was the chief of FBI's counter-espionage section and had led the investigation into the Clinton case and the Trump case. He and Page, as I said, were originally part of the Mueller team until their emails surfaced. He wrote that this is a case which will be in the history books. 1 million people sit in AD, assistant director, and staff jobs. This is a chance to do in maybe the most important case of our lives. He wrote of his guilt over the role he might have had by investigating Clinton, leading to the election of Donald Trump. It was, he noted, unfinished business that he had unleashed with the MYE, that's mid-year exam, that's the code for the Clinton investigation. He said, now I need to fix it and finish it. That's what he said in the email, in the text. By the way, Strzok also lied to the president. He wrote that he had told Trump on 3 occasions that Trump was not under investigation. In pursuing Trump, what were they thinking? James Baker, the FBI's top lawyer, later described a conversation he had with Mccabe and the FBI's top counterintelligence official. A congressman asked Baker if there was a discussion among those folks about whether or not President Trump had been ordered to fire James Comey by the Russian government. And Baker said, I wouldn't say ordered, I would say acting at their behest and somehow following instructions, somehow executing their will. Whether and so literally in order or not, I don't know, but it was discussed as a theoretical possibility. In other words, that the president was either a traitor or was so dumb that he was being manipulated into doing treasonous things. So how did we get there? I'm going to skip over some of this because some of it's available on our website, which is Capitol Research Center, our website, my former organization, and that is having to do with Hillary and the emails, her background, and also Andrew Mccabe, and how he became sort of basically a Clinton operative before becoming the FBI deputy director and acting director. Do you have something? Is it quick?
I just want to make sure that at least there's some balance here. You've given the Fox News approach to all this news, and there is a whole different set of people who don't really agree with most of what you said.
Well, we can talk about if we can talk about it at the end. I would appreciate that, and that's why I made the comment that I made earlier on. If you want to read about these particular things, you can look under my name, Google my name with Capitol Research Center or American Greatness Magazine. Hillary Clinton famously put her emails safe from FOIA requests from journalists and public interest groups, from judges and so forth. She had her State Department email routed to the server in her basement, as you know, and the emails weren't even encrypted for at least a couple of months. A consultant told Wired magazine that computer security was amateur hour. That caused various people who were experts in the realm of counterintelligence to assume that the Russians had Hillary's emails. That's an important point for later on. Mike Flynn, who I mentioned, said at the time that the odds were very high, likely that Russia would break into Hillary's server. Former Deputy CIA Director Mike Morrell, Democrat, said that I think that foreign intelligence services, the good ones, have everything on any unclassified network that the government uses. Others who discussed Hillary's emails being in the hands of the Russians included economist Larry Kudlow, who later became Trump's economic advisor, Fox News, Sean Hannity and KT McFarland talked about it. In January 2016, former Secretary of Defense Robert Gates said he agreed on the odds of the Russians, Chinese, Iranians, and others having the emails. The odds are very high, he said. In February 2016, former CIA Director Michael Hayden said, I would lose all respect for a whole bunch of foreign intelligence agencies if they weren't sitting back paging through the emails. So again, that's an important thing to remember. It was commonly known that the Russians probably had Hillary's emails. Now, why would she take that chance? I mean, actually, in a way, you can go easy on Hillary because it was the common practice in the Obama administration, whether you're talking about IRS officials, Lois Lerner, for example, Lisa Jackson from the EPA, other EPA officials, Justice Department officials, all used fake email accounts or had their emails erased and making them unavailable for FOIA requests and so on. In fact, it seems that word went out to everyone in the Obama administration not to follow the law. And I know that sounds a little out there, but this is the actual exchange between Page and Strzok. Page said the FBI's technology director was, quote, proposing that we just stop following the procedures. OMB, the Office of Management and Budget, told him to capture text, but, quote, we're the only organization, I'm told, who is following that rule. His point is, if no one else is doing it, why should we? There is an Inspector General report that says everyone is failing, so why not just join in the failure, unquote. In other words, don't save the messages, don't preserve them. Even James Comey, as FBI director, used a Gmail account for his business email. And Hillary, of course, responded. She said, but my emails. Basically, she was saying that here Comey was doing what she had been accused of. So let's talk about Russia. With the election of Barack Obama, we were finally, supposedly, done fighting with Russia. Time magazine cover story, Can We Be Friends? The Cold War is History. In fact, the Clinton-Obama foreign policy was oriented toward peace with Russia. Hillary Clinton has the reset button, which actually said overcharged, but had been mistranslated. And that was to start things over, have a new, fresh relationship. Barack Obama ridiculed Mitt Romney in a 2012 debate for calling Russia the biggest geopolitical threat. Quote, "You said Russia, and the 1980s are now calling to ask for their foreign policy back." That's what Obama said to Mitt Romney during the debate. Syria, Georgia, Crimea, missile defense, fracking. The fact is that there was even an effort led by Hillary to build a Russian Silicon Valley, the Skolkovo project that would put 40,000 Russians to work in their own version of Silicon Valley, and this would largely be financed by the United States, and this was seen as a good thing. When Donald Trump got into the race in 2015, now he expressed some similar views. He thought that we should have a more peaceful relationship with Russia. He was a critic of what he saw as unnecessary wars like the Iraq War and counterproductive foreign interventions as he saw them. He said that NATO needed to go in a new direction. It was intended to win the Cold War, and that had been accomplished. The NATO countries were living up to their obligations. They have the obligation to pay 2% of their GDP on defense. It's basically their dues, and only 5 out of the 28 NATO countries had actually met that obligation. And he said he would get along better with Russia. He also praised Putin for being a better leader of his country than Barack Obama was of his, but if you know Trump, he was putting it in the context of he was saying that Barack Obama was a weak leader. He wasn't necessarily praising Putin as much as he was berating Obama. And so it was basically an insult aimed at Obama. And as it turns out, he was pushing these policies, and that got the attention of a lot of people who were Atlanticists, who were strong supporters of NATO. Countries like Germany were sort of panicking because they thought they might have to pay more money for their national defense. And so there was this uproar about Trump and a lot of talk about how he was doing the bidding of the Russians. Worse, from the standpoint of the Obama administration, Trump's top advisor on foreign policy was General Michael Flynn. He was a 30-year veteran of the U.S. Army. He had been Assistant Director of National Intelligence. He'd been appointed by President Obama to be the head of the Defense Intelligence Agency. But he had a falling out with the Obama administration. He became a critic, a very strident critic, and particularly on things like the Iran nuclear deal. He led the chants of lock her up at the Republican convention, which of course incensed Democrats. So Flynn comes into this great conspiracy theory in December 2015 when he attends a dinner in Moscow to celebrate the 10th anniversary of the Russian news propaganda service RT for Russia Today. And he clearly, the impression was, well, you sit next to Putin, you must be a Russian spy or at least a puppet. Also at the table was Jill Stein, who would be the Green Party candidate for president. And so Rachel Maddow and many others basically said the same thing about her, that she was a Russian puppet. And this sitting next to Putin has launched 1,000 conspiracy theories, as I say. But here's the problem. Before Flynn made the trip, he alerted his former employer, the Defense Intelligence Agency. He attended a defensive briefing to sensitize him to possible efforts by the Russians to compromise him. And he was prepared, according to a report by John Solomon in the Hill newspaper, he was prepared for conversations in which he could potentially extract information for U.S. agencies such as the DIA. In other words, he was spying for the United States. And when he returned, he briefed intelligence officials on what he had learned. Sources said the information was moderately useful, about as much as you would expect regarding something that was conducted in public. Skipping back a few months, so October 2015, Fusion GPS enters the picture. The Washington Free Beacon is a website primarily funded by Republican donors, Paul Singer in particular, a Marco Rubio supporter, and edited by Matthew Continetti, who's Bill Kristol's son-in-law. Bill Kristol, as you know, is a very sharp critic of the president. The Free Beacon hires Fusion GPS to conduct opposition research on Republican candidates, especially Trump. Then when Trump wins the nomination, that transfers over to the Democrats, and they start paying Fusion GPS. Specifically, the funding goes through this law firm, Perkins Coie. It's one of those well-connected law firms in Washington, Microsoft, Google. Those are some of their clients. The firm made two notable hires. One was CrowdStrike, which was the computer security firm. They're the people who did the investigation, saying that it was the Russians who had broken into the Democratic National Committee computers. CrowdStrike was originally funded by Eric Schmidt, who was a top advisor to President Obama. The other hire was Fusion GPS, founded by Glenn Simpson, that's him, formerly the Wall Street Journal. And so we're up to March 26, 2016 at this point. Paul Manafort is hired to run the convention operation for the Trump campaign. Just the convention. He would not become chairman until June. I knew of him, at least. That's me at the Republican convention in 1976 when I had hair. And Manafort was working on the other side for the Gerald Ford campaign, and I was aware of him back then. He would later be convicted on charges related to tax fraud, lying on a loan application, failing to disclose a foreign bank account, and other things. And often people see that as a connection to Russia. Looking back at his background, he founded, along with Roger Stone, the person I mentioned as one of the president's top associates, and Lee Atwater, who you may remember was the campaign manager for George H.W. Bush in 1988. Well, in 1980, they founded this firm that became the first sort of influence peddling PR firm. Nobody had ever combined the idea of electing candidates and then lobbying those candidates. And technically they kept it separate, but that was not really true. They represented sleazy foreign interests, Philippines, Zaire, the Center for Public Integrity, which is a left-leaning group, but they called them part of the torturers' lobby. They represented business organizations like Bethlehem Steel and Rupert Murdoch's News Corporation, the Tobacco Institute, the Trump Organization. In 1988, 5 presidential candidates, 3 Republicans and 2 Democrats, had as their top consultants people from this firm. And Atwater, of course, became chairman of the Republican National Committee, died of a brain tumor. Stone was a consultant in Bob Dole's 1996 campaign until he got caught up in a sex scandal. He was the campaign manager for Trump's abortive 2000 campaign for the Reform Party nomination. Manafort ran the 1996 convention for Dole, and Black was chief advisor to John McCain's 2008 presidential campaign, and he worked for Mitt Romney in 2012 and John Kasich in 2016. So you couldn't find a firm more connected than that. So beginning in 2005, Manafort starts working in Ukraine as an advisor to a guy named Viktor Yanukovych, who is a pro-Russian Ukrainian, roughly speaking. It's a little more complicated, but that's good enough. Yanukovych was eventually overthrown and fled to Russia in 2014. But here's the thing. Joining Manafort in these efforts were Mercury Public Affairs, particularly Vin Weber, who was one of the top anti-Trump Republicans in the country in 2016. The Podesta Group, founded by John Podesta, who was Hillary's campaign chairman, and his brother Tony. Also in there was Tad Devine over here, who was the chief strategist for Bernie Sanders later on. Greg Craig, who was the White House counsel for Barack Obama. And one of the people who were supposedly involved in this Russia scandal was a Dmitrio Firtash, who's an organized crime figure, and he was represented, still is represented, I believe, by Lanny Davis. Lanny Davis is the same guy who was the lawyer for Michael Cohen, who was the former Trump associate who turned against Trump in the case of Stormy Daniels. So what you see is everybody in Washington was in on this. They were all connected, and Democrat and Republican, they all did it. Manafort was probably guilty of the things that he was convicted of. But Greg Craig is the only one of all these others who is now being prosecuted. So most of them, it was never a factor. And the Foreign Agents Registration Act, for example, which they went after Manafort under, before this Trump scandal broke out, had been enforced roughly once every 7 years. That was just not, and half of K Street, the lobbyists' world in Washington, probably half of those people violated the Foreign Agents Registration Act. The Justice Department called one of Manafort's business associates, Firtash, upper echelon associate of Russian organized crime. So this shows you how these people are all tied together. By the way, Manafort, there's a funny thing that Dick Morris, who you may remember was Clinton's campaign consultant, and then later went back to working for Republicans, he said that he had lunch at one point with Manafort, and he was complaining that Manafort was getting $30 million to work for the pro-Russian side in Ukraine, while Dick Morris was working for free for the anti-Russian side. So he thought he was not getting a good deal out of that. Now here's the funny part, and this is something that I don't think has been raised very much. McCain had a role in this, John McCain. McCain's campaign manager in 2008 was Rick Davis, who was the partner of Paul Manafort. The firm was Davis Manafort. And Davis and Manafort arranged meetings in 2006 with McCain and, again, that Putin crony, Oleg Deripaska, the aluminum king, at a social gathering in Davos, and 7 months later at a reception in Montenegro celebrating McCain's birthday. So Manafort's work for Deripaska from 2005 to 2009 is often cited as proof of the Trump-Russia connection. But again, here McCain is in a situation where it looks like he's connected to Deripaska. In fact, met with him twice, thanks to Rick Davis, who was Manafort's partner at the time. And where this is significant is, I think, this is my theory, but I believe that a lot of the Russia scandal that we talk about was originally put together to nail John McCain in 2008. And if you recall, when they first tried to use it against Trump in 2016, a lot of the media, they said, this is too fantastic, we're not going to use it. And if you go back and look, you'll see a lot of headlines like this right before the 2008 election, because they were trying to essentially nail McCain for the same thing. I'm not saying he was guilty. I'm saying that he had the same connections through Davis and Manafort that Trump later had, and so I think that's when this was all set up as a storyline that would be fed to the media. Back to Fusion GPS paid an estimated $1.2 million for its research on Trump. Engaged Orbis Business Intelligence, which hired this former British spy, Christopher Steele, or he was a founder of Orbis. He claimed at the time to have extensive contacts in Moscow, although he actually was expelled 20 years earlier, so he had no recent contacts, at least on the ground in Moscow. So April 19th comes around, and this is 2016. Mary Mccabe, the wife of Fusion GPS co-founder Glenn Simpson, visits the White House. We don't know why. And she's important in the story because she and her husband, who were both Wall Street Journal reporters, wrote this story in 2007, and it's all about the connections between Washington lobbyists and the Russians, and people like Bob Dole, so forth. What you find, if you look at this story, is it lays out the entire scenario for what later became the Trump scandal. Doesn't mention Trump, because of course he wasn't in presidential politics, at least not directly at that time. It mentions all the other people. And again, this supports my theory that this is what was laid out, and they picked it up. This is the same people. This is Glenn Simpson and his wife writing this story, and they picked up that scenario and used it later on for their opposition research against Trump. Don Bongino, if you know him, former Secret Service guy, does a lot of commentary. He actually alerted everybody to this article first, so I guess I have to give him credit for that. In May 2016, Roger Stone was visited by a man named Hank Greenberg, who offered dirt on Hillary Clinton for $2 million, but insisted that Trump actually pay for it. And today, Stone says he believes that that was part of a setup, that they were trying to get Trump involved in buying information from the Russians. Greenberg, by the way, was not actually working for the Russians. He's been an FBI informant for 17 years. So again, that supports the setup theory. And then there's George Papadopoulos. Now, he was the reason given by the FBI for originally opening the Trump investigation. They said that he had had a conversation with a diplomat in London, and that's what made them suspicious, and they started investigating Trump. His background is that he was a, quote, Trump advisor, but this was during a period early in the campaign when they couldn't get anybody of stature, pretty much, with a few exceptions, to serve as Trump advisors. There was just too much social pressure and people disagreed with him. A lot of Republican consultants wouldn't work for somebody who thought we should be more peaceful toward Russia and so on, or who thought that the Iraq War was a bad idea. So this is a meeting they had of their foreign policy advisory team, and Papadopoulos has been described by some people as a glorified intern, and that's really true. And the reason we know that is the Washington Post reported it before all this stuff blew up. There was an article in April 2016 in the Washington Post that said that essentially Papadopoulos was claiming to be a foreign policy advisor, but in fact didn't have a background that would justify that. One of his great things on his resume was that he had been a delegate to the Model UN, which, as you know, is something that like Lisa Simpson would brag about on The Simpsons. It's not worth putting on your resume unless you're applying for your first job at McDonald's when you're in college. And that wasn't even true. He wasn't actually a delegate to the Model UN. So he made that part up. He had come in from one of the other campaigns, Ben Carson's campaign, so nobody really vetted him. They just grabbed him because they needed somebody on the list of foreign policy advisors. In any event, so there he is at the table with Trump, and this picture is often shown, and Trump did refer to him as that great guy he's got working for him. He didn't have any idea who he was. So Papadopoulos and the Trump campaign, to be fair, they didn't have any business. They essentially lied and said he was a foreign policy advisor because they had to fill out the list. They paid the price because they had this guy running around who thought he would use his contacts to set up a meeting between Trump and Putin, and if only that would happen, that would establish Trump as a diplomat, and then Trump would just easily win the election. It's a crazy thing. All the people at campaign headquarters kept telling him, just do your work, don't bother with this, go off, and he kept trying to do it. So he ends up at the Kensington Wine Garden in Kensington Wine Rooms in London in May 2016. He encounters a Bill Clinton friend named Alexander Downer, who's the ambassador from Australia. And they have a night of heavy drinking, as it was described in the New York Times, at this bar. And at that point, Papadopoulos starts blurting out that he thought that Moscow had thousands of emails that would embarrass Hillary Clinton, apparently stolen in an effort to try to damage her campaign. In other words, months later, after the Clinton campaign started accusing Trump of working with the Russians, Downer, who had once arranged, for example, a $25 million donation to the Clinton organization, he would come forward with this story and it would supposedly launch the investigation. If you go back and look, you'll see there are a lot of references to foreign intelligence being the basis for the investigation. It was Australian intelligence, and it was coming from Alexander Downer. Here's the problem, though, with this whole thing. He's saying that a drunk guy who worked in the Trump campaign told him that he had heard 3 weeks earlier that there were embarrassing Clinton emails in the hands of the Russians. And this story, Papadopoulos told him, was told to him by a professor who said he had met with high-level Russian officials who told him that they had dirt on Hillary. So it's a secondhand story. He's saying something that he said he had no direct knowledge of, but that he had heard. And then he's passing this along to Downer. And then they use it to open an investigation spying on the opposition political campaign. There is no precedent for anything like that. And I should mention one other thing, and that is that Downer, until he resigned to become the ambassador, was on the board of Huawei, the Chinese company that's 99% owned by the government and is considered by many experts to be a threat to U.S. national security. So literally, he's a Chinese agent in the sense that he was being paid by the Chinese to be on the board of Huawei. And Papadopoulos, in fact, claims, and who knows, but he claims that that was the main thing that Downer wanted to talk about that evening, was Trump's position on Huawei, and would Trump be mean to Huawei. So, you know, very suspicious, very strange, not someone you would necessarily depend on. And he's telling a story that doesn't mean anything. I knew at that time that the Russians probably had Hillary's emails, as did all those other people I cited earlier. So the idea that repeating that is somehow grounds for a counterintelligence investigation is kind of ridiculous. So anyway, so May 19th, Manafort takes over the Trump campaign. May 23rd, Nellie Orr applies for a ham radio license. That may or may not be significant. Her husband did come up with a WhatsApp program that he used to communicate with Christopher Steele. So they both seem to be interested in finding ways to communicate with people without using traditional means or regular means of communication. Anyway, sometime around then, Nellie Orr goes to work for Fusion GPS. So her husband then meets with Glenn Simpson. Now remember, Bruce Orr is the guy in charge of organized crime at the FBI. And after WikiLeaks' possession of leaked emails becomes known, the Democrats became, again, claiming it's the Russians. That day, Strzok and Page text each other about how Trump is winning the nomination, and therefore that increases the pressure to finish the Clinton probe. And of course, the question you have to ask is, well, why would Trump winning the nomination increase the pressure to finish the probe of Hillary Clinton, which should technically be totally unrelated? So CrowdStrike, hired by Perkins Coie, investigates the DNC leaks, and they say it's the Russians. The feds are denied access to the Democrats' computers, but who knows? I accept the people who, until I hear better evidence that it was in fact the Russians. Some of the leaking probably was done by Bernie Sanders supporters in addition to the things that were stolen by the Russians, but that'll all be sorted out, I think, over time. So in June, the FBI applies for a Fisa warrant to monitor the Trump team. This is turned down, which is very unusual. In one period that they looked at, I think there were 13,000 Fisa warrant applications and only 11 were turned down. So very, very rare, but this was bad enough that they required them to go back and work on it some more. And then on June 9th, there's the famous Trump Tower meeting, which is Don Jr., and then he pulls in Paul Manafort and other officials of the campaign with a woman named Natalia Veselnitskaya. You probably know a lot about this. If you were here last year, you heard me talk about this in great detail, so I won't really go into it this time because it all boils down to this. This is kind of like an episode of Columbo where you come this close to committing the perfect crime. And that is that we're told that this meeting, Natalia Veselnitskaya and another Russian, coming to Trump Tower and meeting with Don Jr., supposedly to give him the email that set up the meeting said she was going to have dirt on Hillary, basically that Hillary was colluding with the Russians. And they show up at Trump Tower and they end up having a discussion that is about adoption. And the reason it was about adoption, everybody laughed at that when the Trump people said that, but they were talking about the Magnitsky. She started talking about the Magnitsky Act, which is one of the sanctions against Russia. And Putin had retaliated by cutting off Russian adoptions. So the argument for repealing the Magnitsky Act was, well, you'll be able to free up these Russian adoptions. So it's plausible that that's what she was talking about. But anyway, here's the thing. Here's the smoking gun. Here's how you know it was a setup. And again, it's like an episode of Columbo. They came that close. Glenn Simpson had dinner with Natalia Veselnitskaya the night before the Trump Tower meeting, and he had dinner with her the night after the Trump Tower meeting. He admitted this under oath. Now, this revelation became known in November 2017 and was confirmed in January 2018. That means every person or organization that has cited the Trump Tower meeting as proof of collusion since January 2018 has been wrong, either lying or they're just misinformed. And I think most people just heard about the Trump Tower meeting, sounded suspicious, they made the worst possible assumptions, Reasonably so. I understand that. But the fact is, it was a setup. It was either a setup or it was the greatest coincidence in American history that Glenn Simpson, in charge of proving Trump's a Russian spy, has dinner the night before and the night after with the woman whose presence proves that Trump's a Russian spy. That's just amazing. And by the way, the Mueller report mentions this little bit of information, but they don't mention Glenn Simpson. They don't mention Fusion GPS. What they say, they mention it only peripherally as part of the conspiracy theory being spread by the Trump people to obstruct the investigation. So they don't even give it the respect that, wait a minute, it really did happen. And there is no explanation for it other than that it was a setup. When Mueller was asked during his testimony why Glenn Simpson and Fusion GPS aren't mentioned, and by the way, I have electronic copies so you can do a keyword search if you don't believe me, and I have the actual physical book there. When Mueller was asked about it, he said, well, it wasn't within my purview. It wasn't within his purview whether the meeting that he spent a big chunk of the Mueller report writing about was a setup. I mean, that's ridiculous. And by the way, I don't think Mueller wrote the report. I think his name was on it, and he's had to stand by it. But I think it was Weissman and some of the others who actually wrote the report. In any event, so we're having the Trump Tower meeting. It's 2016. That's when we start hearing about, or when Steele rather first writes the memo that says that Trump. And for those who haven't heard, I'll do it real quickly. During a visit to the Ritz-Carlton in Moscow, Trump stays in a room that had been occupied by the Obamas. He had prostitutes urinate on the bed to defile it. This was recorded by Russian intelligence and used to blackmail Trump into working for the Russians. Okay, that's the story. July 5th, Steele meets with an FBI agent in London. Peter Strzok signs documents opening the probe into Trump-Russia collusion. It's called Crossfire Hurricane, after the Rolling Stones song. Remember, Trump used Rolling Stones music in his campaign, so this is sort of a cut at Trump. July 19th, in the second memo, Steele alleges that Carter Page, who's the person in the picture who was on that committee of so-called foreign policy advisors that they threw together, that he met with Russian officials and that the Trump campaign chairman was handling the collusion with the Russians. Page, in fact, had been approached by the Russians as a potential agent. He worked in Russia for investment companies, and it's common for them to go after an American who's working in Moscow or in Russia in general to recruit them. That happens all the time. In his case, he turned the person in and the person was subsequently convicted based on his reports to the FBI. So, okay, I guess it could be one of those things where he's really clever and he turns in the other spy so that he's more credible when he's going on and being a spy. But this seems to indicate that he was not a Russian spy, but that he was just an American working in Moscow. He had worked for, he'd been the VP in the Moscow office of Merrill Lynch. And so July 24th comes around. Clinton campaign manager Robbie Mook goes on a variety of TV shows to promote the idea that Trump is behind the theft of the documents and that Trump is colluding with the Russians. The Fisa court rejects another application to spy on Carter Page. And around this time, Susan Rice, who was the Obama National Security Advisor, begins to show more interest in unmasking Americans. What is unmasking? Unmasking is, when you, in this age of massive surveillance, where the NSA is picking up signals from all over the world, you're going to pick up conversations between foreign nationals and Americans, or U.S. persons. If it's a foreigner who's legally in the United States, or in the United States at all, that's a U.S. person. And you're not supposed to spy on those people. You're an intelligence agency. That's something the FBI does, so the CIA, the NSA, they're not supposed to look at that except under special situations. That's when you unmask somebody. So if you get a conversation and you want to hear the other side, you want to see who was the person on the other side of the conversation, if it's an American, then you unmask that person. Suddenly they started unmasking all these people as in order to find out what was happening in these conversations. So it's a good way to spy on people if you do it willy-nilly, if you do it all over the place, and they were doing it. They were doing hundreds of these. And Susan Rice, by the way, isn't an intelligence official, wasn't. So it would have been unusual for her to ask for such a thing. Normally you go through the intelligence channels. So July 27th, Donald Trump holds a press conference. He's trying to step on the Democrats' convention in terms of press coverage. So half jokingly, and if you look at it, and I've shown this to people, and if they'll look at it, yeah, he's kind of joking. He calls on because he's saying sarcastically something about the press. He calls on the Russians to turn over their copies of Hillary's missing emails, the ones that the experts said the Russians had or probably had. The ones that, and this is important, Hillary had said she destroyed. So Trump says, Russia, if you're listening, I hope you'll be able to find the 30,000 emails that are missing. He says, I think you will probably be rewarded mightily by our press. Now, if there was ever a sarcastic comment, it's Donald Trump praising the U.S. press. So, in any event, he says, she gets subpoenaed and she gets rid of 33,000 emails. That gives me a problem. Now, if Russia or China or any other country has those emails, I mean, to be honest with you, I'd love to see them. He's then accused by hundreds of news media outlets of calling on the Russians to hack into Hillary's emails. The problem with that is, these are the emails that have been destroyed. Unless you've got a time machine, you can't turn around and hack into her emails.
Intercepted before she scrubbed. What the hell?
And that's the point. So how can he be calling on them to do something in the future that they had already done?
What they already have.
He's asking them, yes, it's like your uncle has his car stolen, and then you call on the person who stole the car to return it. You're not calling on someone to steal the car. And that's the point. Yeah.
You understand that those destroyed emails were just a copy of the ones they actually had, so there were no actual emails destroyed. You understand that?
No, because the point is that they couldn't find the emails. The emails have never been found to this day.
The copy.
Well, she destroyed her copy. The senders would all have their copy, and all the other recipients.
Not only that, but
She
the
told
server.
the people when she was subpoenaed that the emails didn't exist and they were destroyed. She
And they were-
couldn't answer the subpoena.
But they did
Some-
exist on the back.
Some of the emails were recovered by getting them from other people, but the point is you didn't know who they came from, so you had a very hard time doing that. And certainly any emails that might have been, that Hillary would have wanted destroyed, clearly they're not going to know who those emails came from. That's the point. Anyway, let's get to that at the end, if it's okay.
You've got so many half-truths that it's
Well-
really amazing.
Take out a notepad, write them down, and then hit me with it later, okay?
I won't
You're
bother.
making apologies for the man.
Of course
He's an
not, 'cause you're
asshole.
so
4 days, look, I'm reporting what I believe to be the truth. And you can say I'm wrong, you can say I'm lying if you want, whatever, but I'm not apologizing for anybody. I'm trying to report the truth. 4 days later, the FBI begins its counterintelligence operation. In comes Stephen Halper. Now, he was the son-in-law of Ray Klein, who was the top analyst at the CIA in the early 1960s. He was the national policy director for George Bush, the father's presidential campaign against Ronald Reagan, and then worked for the Reagan campaign after Bush lost. He is alleged to have been a person who stole Jimmy Carter's briefing book or was involved in that during the debate that supposedly gave Reagan an advantage in the debate. That story's been floating around for decades. He was very well connected, earning $1 million from a Defense Department think tank in 2012 to 2016. And he was a strong opponent of Donald Trump, but presented himself to Trump people as a supporter. The FBI asked Halper to reach out to Carter Page and to George Papadopoulos, trying to get dirt from them on a connection between the Trump campaign and Russia. By the way, he's involved in civil litigation right now where he says he was working for the government in doing this. So this is not supposition on my part. In August, he met with the Trump co-chair and offered to be a foreign policy advisor, again pretending to be a Trump supporter. So yes, the FBI was spying on the Trump campaign. The question is, was it justified? But they were spying. This came up when James Comey tried to say that they weren't spying on the Trump campaign. The New York Times reported that Papadopoulos was targeted for spying. Again, the New York Times. If for spying, if not for an outright honey trap. And that is to say, an attractive woman who was sent his way named Azra Turk, who was described, Papadopoulos described her as very flirtatious, but the New York Times said that she was basically trying to get influence, get close to Papadopoulos to get him to say something incriminating that could be recorded. And that's right. That's apparently what was happening. So the Steele dossier at this point gets to the desk of Peter Strzok. August 6, Strzok responds to an article shared by Page by replying, F Trump. Page says, maybe you're meant to stay where you are because you are meant to protect the country from that menace. Strzok, I can protect our country at many levels, not sure if that helps. August 8th, Lisa Page texts him and says, Trump is not ever going to become president, right? Right? And he says, no, he won't. We'll stop it. August 15th, Strzok to Page. I want to believe the path you threw out for consideration in Andy's office, that there's no way he gets elected. But I'm afraid we can't take that risk. It's like an insurance policy in the unlikely event you die before you're 40. Andy is Andy Mccabe. August 26th, Strzok in text. Just went to a Southern Virginia Walmart. I could smell the Trump support. Smell is all caps. And that's fine. That's their political opinions. But again, I'm talking, one of the factors is in fact bias. How did they see the world? Why did they assume that Hillary Clinton would have had a good motive and therefore was not guilty because she had a good motive, and even if she did what she did? Whereas Trump, they were very careful to find any connection they could or make any assumption that was against him. When McCabe's wife lost her state Senate race in Loudoun County, Virginia, Strzok blamed it on ignorant hillbillies. He misspelled hillbillies. Loudoun County, by the way, at the time was the richest county in America. So apparently, richest county in America, but filled with hillbillies. August 25th, John Brennan, the CIA director, briefs Senate Minority Leader Harry Reid that unnamed advisors to Mr. Trump might be working with the Russians to interfere in the election. Reid is famous for his role in 2012, smearing Mitt Romney, claiming Romney didn't pay his taxes. And later, if he was asked if this was McCarthyism, and his response was, Romney didn't win, did he? Now, Reid sends a letter to Comey that appears to reflect claims in the dossier pressuring Comey to go after Trump. Page writes to Strzok on September 2nd about prepping Comey because, quote, POTUS wants to know everything we're doing. POTUS, of course, is the President of the United States. Fusion GPS's Steele becomes an FBI source and uses Associate Deputy Attorney General Bruce Orr as the point of contact. Remember, the wife, Nellie Orr, was working for Fusion GPS. Steele tells Orr that he's desperate that Donald Trump not get elected. They brief reporters from the New York Times, Washington Post, CNN, The New Yorker, Yahoo News. Most of them don't go with the story. At one point, they claim that Carter Page, the guy who was on this advisory committee, who never, as far as anyone knows, actually met Trump, didn't communicate with Trump, has not been charged with anything after being investigated for literally years for supposedly being a spy. And the story was that Carter Page was offered $1 billion bribe to influence Trump on the Russian sanctions. $1 billion bribe, which is insane. September 23rd, Yahoo News publishes an article about the possibility of ties between the Russians and the Trump campaign, and that's based on the dossier. Now, what they did, the FBI did then, was they took the Yahoo News story and they used it with the Fisa application to say, oh, it's not just us. Look, independently, a news organization has proven that this is true, or has found evidence that this is true, when in fact it was simply the news organization repeating, and they've admitted this, repeating what was in the dossier. Early October, the news media makes sure we understand that our election systems are secure and that only crazy right-wing conspiracy theorists think our elections can be rigged. And don't you dare suggest that Russians could rig the election, Time magazine said on October 10th, 2016. Don't fall for that crazy idea. On October 3rd, the FBI seizes computers belonging to Anthony Weiner, who was married to Huma Abedin, Hillary's top aide, and copies of a lot of the emails that ended up on his computer, along with where he was trying to solicit underage girls. And so this leads to a reopening of the investigation by Comey, and then of course that's often cited as something that cost Hillary the election in the end. Interestingly, Comey later said he didn't know that Abedin and Weiner were married, even though everybody who followed politics pretty much knew that. I mean, and even if you just read People magazine, you would know that. But in any event, October 7th, you get the Director of National Intelligence and the Department of Homeland Security issue a statement blaming the Russians for hacking the Democrats, saying that, and this is on the same day that the Access Hollywood tape is released. October 11th, Christopher Steele meets with Deputy Assistant Secretary of State Kathleen Kavalek, who realizes he doesn't know what he's talking about. This is what she writes. She warns the FBI, don't listen to this guy. To give you one example, he claims the Russians are running this election interference scheme through the consulate, the Russian consulate in Miami. And this is to Russian immigrants in the United States. There is no Russian consulate in Miami. And so she notes this and various other obvious errors in his story, factual facts that show he doesn't know what he's talking about, and she warns the FBI, but they continue with the case even so. In fact, the FBI certifies to the Fisa court they have no derogatory information on their source, which is Steele, even though Kathleen Kavalek from the State Department has warned them not to use this person. So the FBI issues, finally gets the warrant. They can use it retroactively, the way that information is collected up by the NSA, and you can use it. There's what's called the two-hop rule. So if you communicate with somebody and then they communicate with somebody, you can go that many steps out, meaning essentially that you could spy on the entire Trump campaign through Carter Page, who was the subject of the warrant, because he had emails from the Trump campaign. So then you take one step to the Trump campaign and then anybody they communicate with, and so on. Again, because they said that this information, they didn't say that this information was opposition research from the Clinton campaign, the FISA warrant is bogus. But it's still, it's used. So they also claim, by the way, that Michael Cohen connected the Trump campaign to Russia when he traveled to Prague to meet with various officials, to a particular Russian official, and Prague. Michael Cohen never went to Prague. And there are some conspiracy theorists who say, well, he could have gone there and not had it show up on his passport records and so on. But remember, he pled guilty, and his main bargaining chip would have been, if this were true, that he'd gone to Prague, that he could turn Trump in the Trump campaign by saying, see, there really was this connection through Prague, and he didn't. So he didn't go to Prague. David Korn of Mother Jones, October 31st, writes an article, again, on this information. James Baker, the person I mentioned at the FBI, was possibly the source for some of that. He's good friends with Korn and was meeting with him regularly during this period. And then we get up to November 8th. Trump wins. The media are surprised, really surprised. Actually, that's a Newsweek that was accidentally released, and I have a copy of that. So this was a shock. Robbie Mook, the campaign manager, and John Podesta, the campaign chairman, they, in the shock after Hillary loses, they assemble the communications team and they try to come with a way to explain away the election results. And that's when they put Russia at the top of the list. Meanwhile, an FBI attorney, Kevin Kleinsmith, texts another FBI employee, his girlfriend, that he was numb and couldn't stop crying. He said the crazies won finally. This is the Tea Party on steroids. The GOP is going to be lost. Also, Pence is stupid. He adds, my God, excuse my language here. He adds, my goddamn name is all over the legal documents investigating Trump's staff. And then he writes, Viva la resistance. Michael Rogers, who's the head of the NSA, meets with President-elect Trump on November 17th at Trump Tower and reportedly tells him about the spying on his campaign. The next day, the Trump organization moves out to Trump's golf course in New Jersey. A campaign to oust Rogers is launched by people at the Pentagon and in the intelligence community. It's alleged that this was in retaliation for him telling Trump. November 18th, Sir Andrew Wood, a British ambassador to Moscow from 1995 to 2000, meets with John McCain at the Halifax International Security Forum in Canada, tells McCain about the existence of the dossier. In early December, McCain obtains a copy from David Kramer, who's one of his top aides, ran the McCain Institute. McCain gives it to Comey and spreads it around Washington. And again, the irony is that, in my theory, and I believe this to be the case, McCain was the original target when this was all put together back in 2008, and here he is now furthering the dossier getting out, believed to be true. He wrote in his memoir he would do it again. He said, "I would do it again. Anyone who doesn't like it can go to hell." That's the way John McCain talked. But it was McCain, remember in 2008, who was meeting with Oleg Deripaska, the Russian who supposedly connected Manafort to Putin. December 9th, President Obama orders the intelligence community to conduct the investigation into Russia's attempts to interfere in the election. Steele files his final report. The unclassified version of the Intelligence Community Assessment Report came out on January 7th, less than 2 weeks before Trump took office. And it was reported by the news media. It was backed by 17 intelligence agencies. The report itself doesn't even say that. It says 3 intelligence agencies, the FBI, the CIA, and the NSA. But the NSA only had moderate confidence, which in intelligence speak means they were skeptical. So it was fully supported by 2 intelligence agencies, which is the FBI and the CIA, under Comey and Brennan. And then if you look at it, and I'll let you read some of the things I've written online about this, but the analysts were handpicked. They should never be handpicked for something like this. That's how you end up with a fake finding of WMDs in Iraq. That's how you end up with some of the things that happened before the Cuban Missile Crisis, and so on. Throughout the history of the intelligence agencies, when they've handpicked the analysts has been usually when they end up with the bad report. And this was admitted. And that these were handpicked. That's what General Clapper, the DNI, the Director of National Intelligence, said. The Russians, according to the report, though, even in the report, the Russians moved away from trying to help Trump toward the end of the campaign when they realized he didn't have a chance. Rachel Maddow was really excited about the report, but the things that it said in there, and I would ask you to read it. It's 5 pages is the main part of the report. It has a 1.5 pages of summary of the 5 pages, and then has a section that is about how the Russians, it's the biggest section in the report, 7 pages. And it was about how the Russians were conducting an influence campaign through RT, Russia Today, and Sputnik, their news services. And I get the concern, but pretty much every country has some sort of news operation that is a propaganda operation of that country's elites. And they presented it as if this were somehow a surprise, like people would be fooled that RT, which stands for Russia Today, and Sputnik were Russian operations, presenting Russian propaganda. And they list things that that RT did to harm the United States and to undermine democracy. Examples like they hosted a presidential debate for third-party presidential candidates. And that's listed as an effort to undermine U.S. democracy. Most of the report is about their support for grassroots populism in America. And this supposedly ties this to Trump. The problem is, again, if you read it, this is not hard to see if you read it, there's nothing in there that's dated after 2012. And that's because what they're talking about, the grassroots populist movement, is Occupy Wall Street. And they did. They created an app for Occupy Wall Street. They created programming for Occupy Wall Street. They hired Occupy Wall Street people to work at RT. Yes, they were closely allied with Occupy Wall Street. How that incriminates Donald Trump, who's basically the opposite ideologically of Occupy Wall Street, I don't know. But if you read the report, that's what it says. I've described it as, and of course they're dangerous hosts, former wrestler and Minnesota Governor Jesse Ventura, Ed Schultz, formerly of MSNBC, and of course Larry King. Okay, maybe Larry King is a threat to America, but anyway, what was the real purpose of the intelligence community assessment? James Clapper said, if it weren't for President Obama, we might not have done the intelligence community assessment that we did. That set off a whole sequence of events that are still unfolding today. This was July 19th when he said this. Notably, the Mueller investigation. President Obama is responsible for that, and it was he who tasked us to do the intelligence community assessment in the first place. My view, you can challenge this, is that they had a goal in mind, which was to come to the conclusion they did, and that this biased their reporting. Scott Shane from the New York Times said in January 2018 at a New York Times forum that that we had to be open to the possibility that the Russians were trying to make Hillary look bad, but that they were also trying to make Trump look bad because they wanted whoever the president ended up being to be someone they made look bad. What if they also, this is a quote, what if they also, kind of hedging their bets, also carried out an information operation aimed at Donald Trump with the idea of, quote, casting a shadow over Trump? And he says, well, it worked if that's what the Russians were intending to do. It was a Russian achievement, if that's true. So even the New York Times guy was open to that possibility. So the Obama administration ends. You have there was a tremendous amount of hundreds of unmasking situations, including Samantha Power, who's the UN ambassador, who basically never should be unmasking anybody. And strangely enough, she now claims that wasn't her. So somebody was supposedly doing this in her name. They need to run the dirty dossier story on CNN in order for that to happen. They need an official briefing of the president. So Comey briefs the president on this accusation, and you'll see that that was something that stuck in Trump's craw for reasons that I'll get to in a moment. Thank goodness we have the news media protect us. This is a Washington Post story about how the crowd at the inauguration had 6 Russians in it, the 9th largest country on earth. And this is considered investigative reporting, that they found 6 Russians there in the crowd. And then the question is, what were the Russians doing there, and so on. So let's talk a little bit about the Russian meddling. I'll jump through some of this. If you don't know, the Internet Research Agency was founded in St. Petersburg. This is supposedly who committed this social media campaign. The Internet Research Agency was founded by a caterer and restaurateur who became a crony of Putin. He then gets the contract for school lunches. The parents get on the internet to complain, so he ends up setting up a counter operation to basically shout down their complaints online, and that becomes the Internet Research Agency. And if you read the Mueller indictments of the 13 Russians, you'll see that they had no sophistication at all. They learned in June 2016 there was such a thing as a swing state. They had 2 people traveling across the country. They learned in June 2016 there was such a thing as a swing state. They learned about American politics by watching episodes of House of Cards. And they ran ads, and I'll run through these ads really quickly. But these are the ads. These are the 3,517 ads released by the Democrats on the House Intelligence Committee that supposedly promoted Trump. And you've got one having a 2-year-old throwing a tea party for a police officer. Ads promoting a black business directory, promoting black achievement. Black women with advanced degrees are elected as judges, or being mayor in Baton Rouge. A man who was a hero during the attack on the House Republican baseball team. A man giving his wife his kidney. And then there's a promotion of Dr. and Mrs. Martin Luther King. Black dolls for girls to play with because diversity makes America great. The Russian campaign promoted legal education in the black community and free self-defense classes. They pay people $320 a week to provide self-defense classes. American Indians blocking the Dakota Access Pipeline. Opposing oil companies that violated burial grounds, ads promoting solar power and wind and attacking oil companies, encouraging Christians to turn the other cheek, and catch up with Jesus. Muslims, they said, are right about Jesus not being crucified. Religion is bad, science is good. We should support wounded female veterans. Mexicans are better at throwing weddings and at cooking. Minorities should stand against hate. Their tributes to Carrie Fisher and Rihanna, and so on, and so on, and so on. At one point in here, they had competing rallies for and against Beyonce. Basically, every issue you could find, they were on both sides. And mostly, though, there was a heavy emphasis on that's where they promoted the State Fair of Texas. There was a heavy emphasis on Black Lives Matter, 3 issues, Black Lives Matter, and all the issues that Black Lives Matter raised, the Mexican nationalism, and the third was anti-fracking, which of course the Russians are against fracking because they have oil and gas reserves. They don't want people having more oil and gas production. So as you can see, they're on every side of every issue. I have these lined up where you can see on one side and then the other side. Sometimes nonsensical stuff.
Is this in a detailed report with footnotes and the thing? I went to your website during this presentation and I looked at your biography. You've got a very impressive educational background.
Okay.
But, you know, we're all MENSA people. We're not the people off the street. And I assume you know that. So what we like to see, most of us like to see, is a detailed report with footnotes and citations that can be analyzed and not a talk. This is all going so fast. You know, it's
I understand that. I understand that.
So if you're serious about this, that's what you need to do. This needs to be in a written document with citations and preferably the other side is saying this, and this is what we're saying, and comparing the analysis and putting all that out there in a lengthy report. If you're serious about this, because that's the way you analyze this. It's impossible to go through this and understand, even as intelligent people and well-read people in this room, everything you're saying in the context is because, you know, there's umpteen thousand additional facts, as you would admit, not even discussed here, some of which may be direct and some may be peripheral, as some could argue about your points. That's what you need to do. I mean, that's the bottom line.
Yeah, and I would respond, first of all, I'm working on a book on this, and that will have the information you're talking about. Obviously, I've got to squeeze everything into the time available, which, you know, is very limited, and this is very complex. There are probably 1,000 named individuals in this that are involved, and I can't go through all of them and their roles. And so, you know, I will respond to your criticism. I have a lot of pieces, as you can see, that have, I have sources within the text. Rather than a footnote, I might say according to the New York Times of a certain date, that kind of thing. But I always document everything. I don't, when I write opinion pieces, that might have an opinion at the beginning and the end, but everything in between, I try to make hardcore facts. And so that's what I try to do when I do these kind of stories.
What I'm hearing is that you don't have the opinion that the investigation should ever have been started.
The original investigation was illegal, which was spying on the Trump campaign. This was something that Nixon did. And remember, the reason for the Watergate break-in, according to E. Howard Hunt, who was the head of the plumbers, and he explained to Eugenio Martinez, who was one of the plumbers, the main plumber under him, that the reason they were doing it is because the Democrats were getting money from the Cubans. Now, the Cubans didn't have any money. All their money was Russian money. So basically what he was saying was they were getting money from the Russians. So J. Edgar Hoover went after Martin Luther King because Martin Luther King, in J. Edgar Hoover's view, was too cozy to the Russians and had people around him who were communists and therefore were getting information from the Russians. The CIA in the 1960s put out word. There's an article by Thomas O'Neill, who was a big political writer at the time. The CIA put out word that if you criticized them over the Bay of Pigs and other mistakes they had made, they would label you a Russian dupe. That's the language they were using in telling the members of Congress. So all these are things that have happened before. And I'm saying this is part of a pattern. Goldwater in 1964 was spied on by the CIA. They had a front, which was a Continental News Service. It was CIA front. And they would get from a spy in the Goldwater campaign, would give them press releases and Goldwater's upcoming schedule so that the Johnson campaign always knew, and then they would take it to the White House. And then Howard Hunt was the same guy who spied on Goldwater that ended up spying on McGovern during the Nixon campaign, who was an FBI guy. So I'm saying this is part of the culture. J. Edgar Hoover would always confront presidents with basically, here's what I have on you as potential blackmail, but don't worry, I'll protect you from these terrible stories getting out. And then that's why J. Edgar Hoover was head of the FBI for 48 years, because nobody dared get rid of it. And, this is the way the world works. And, it's...
The Russians have long said, hey, America, look how you treat your black people.
Well, and in fact, and look, also understand, because sometimes people misinterpret this. When I talk about them targeting Black Lives Matter issues, the Russians have been targeting African Americans for 100 years. Why do they do that? Because there are very real grievances. And they're always going to target people who have real grievances, and sometimes exaggerated. Some things could be made up. I can talk about that sometime. But basically, they want to find people who are upset at our system. And they want to take advantage of that. Yeah. And that doesn't mean that the causes are not real, that people are concerned about. Yeah.
There's two things here. First of all, when you talk about the ads that RT placed,
Yeah.
you forget to mention that they were specifically targeted to certain groups. So the ones that were going out about blacks were going out to extremely conservative whites. Okay? Very, very well targeted. Now, another thing, you just talked about the Russian opinion of blacks. Well, you know that the Russians thought that Harlem was a very good place because it was a good example of how minorities were treated the way that the Russians would have treated them.
Oh, yeah.
And so your characterization of that particular facet is completely backwards. The characterization you have about these ads is also, it's not properly grained.
Mark Penn, who was the campaign manager in 1996 for Bill Clinton and for Hillary Clinton in 2008, said that the value of the Russian ads that were actually in the election and were not after the election, most of the Russian ads were after the election, were not so far before the election that they wouldn't have any effect, and that were targeted in any way so as to get swing voters, basically swing states and so on. He said the value of those ads was $6,800. That's enough to buy about 80 votes. If you're a campaign manager in a national campaign.
The cost of it is different from the value of it, and the value is an issue of to whom. The to whom there,
Targeting,
they had a great effect on the swing.
No, that's the point. They weren't targeted. The Russians didn't even, their people who were running this advertising campaign found that you didn't even know there was such a thing as a swing state as late as June, according to the Mueller indictment.
They wanted to look bad? They
No.
wanted to look stupid? They wanted to look incompetent?
Russians know about...
What is it?
In my opinion, Russians know about as much about American politics as Americans know about Russian politics.
That's not even close to true.
So there's people living in Russia who think they're Americans. They think they're in America. They don't know.
No, I'm
The
saying...
Russian opinions about the Americans are more close to the reality than most of the American pollsters.
They don't know how to run a presidential campaign. They don't know how to do an influence operation. They're learning. Don't get me wrong. They're learning. They want to know it. They worked really hard on it. A lot of the stuff that you saw from those ads that I was pointing out were things that were designed to be clickbait or designed to collect names and addresses. That's how you organize a modern campaign. So yes, they were laying the groundwork for future operations, including possibly influencing elections in the future. If you
think this is a good thing?
No,
Okay, you hadn't particularly made that clear.
no. I'm saying, but my point is, they weren't influencing in any significant way the 2016 campaign.
Oh, that's not true.
No, I'm sure they did.
I think that it's worthwhile to
that's
say
my point.
something quickly.
Yeah.
My
Yeah.
wife is the director of the Voice of America for the Soviet bloc.
Okay.
Okay, she has been studying propaganda for many years.
Sure.
She studied it in Russia before she came here. And she says exactly the opposite of you about what, and I know that my in-laws knew more about what was going on in the U.S. than most of the people that I spoke to in the U.S. So I think that you're
Look,
completely mischaracterized.
I obviously respect your opinion, and I'm sure your wife is very knowledgeable in these things. Here's the problem, and if you were here 2 years ago and heard my speech on why Hillary lost, the Clinton campaign didn't understand how, for example, the Electoral College worked. I mean, literally didn't.
Not true.
I can't believe that's exactly right. That is precisely it.
She misread it. But she certainly
Totally, the primaries against Obama for that reason.
Remember,
Couldn't figure out the way the system works. She
Hillary-
should have beaten Obama.
Remember, Hillary won the popular vote in 2008 against Barack Obama because they didn't know in the Clinton campaign, they did not understand how the nomination process worked. Her campaign manager at one point pointed to a chart and said, don't worry, we'll make these losses up when we get to California, which is winner take all, and they had to point out that it hadn't been winner take all for years. They just didn't bother with those kinds of things.
In the closing days of the Hillary campaign, she announced she was going to Arizona.
Exactly.
And
She
Bill blew his top because he knew she should be in Ohio and Michigan and Wisconsin.
Wisconsin. They didn't go to Wisconsin during the entire fall campaign.
Exactly. And
That's my point. I'm not saying they didn't understand what's in the Constitution about the Electoral College. I'm saying they didn't understand how that plays into a political campaign. And if the Clinton campaign did do it, I think it's a stretch to say that somehow the Russians were uber masterminds of this above the level of anything in
I
the
also
Clinton
think, to
campaign.
be fair, I don't think anybody at this point fully understands how social media works. I really think that's true. Because people are putting out stuff and it backfires. And the other thing, and there's this theory, and I sort of subscribe to it, that says you put out a certain amount of ads of whatever, and you reach the saturation point. So we had this in Arizona where I'm from, and you guys probably have had it here before, where we had Sinema, the Democrat, running against Mccabe, the Republican.
Right.
And the ads went on and on. Well, after 15, 20, 30 ads, I don't care where they are, your brain tunes it out, right?
Yeah.
And so you reach the saturation point. So the fact that, okay, somebody else spent more here, or somebody else had this ad here, or this thing was targeted here, the theory is, and again, I subscribe to it, you just start saying, it just becomes like background noise, like you've got a baseball game you're not paying attention to anymore. It just goes over your head. Okay, there comes another one, you just ignore it. And it's different if somebody is outspent 10 to 1, but if you get to that certain level, which both camps are at, the fact that the Russians were doing ad, or somebody else was targeting ads, or this group, the Soros group, or the Koch group, it's just saturation point. It makes no difference. What can make a difference is if you focus like on turnout on the ground, that kind of stuff.
Right.
Because that's got nothing to do with bombarding somebody with ads. But
And again, that's my point about the Russians.
That's not really, you're right about it being that way for the neophyte. But if you talk to Steve Bannon, if you talk to a girl named Brittany Kaiser, if you talk to people that are in, the Cambridge Analytica group, you'll find out that the percentages that they did, the good statistics that they did, worked very, very well.
Can I ask you a question? Let me ask a question.
Go ahead.
Are you finished with your presentation yet?
I think I am. I'm taking questions.
We want all the therefores, and like the Warrant Commission was just bullshit, and we
I
went on the
missed the
whatever
closing statement.
it leads to.
Yeah, and Trump had a lot of interest in Russia. He was trying to build this Trump Tower.
The main project that he wanted that he thought he had a chance for was the Miss Universe pageant, and that didn't work. And that was basically, he wanted a sweetheart deal like movie companies get when they go to Georgia, and he didn't get it. And then there was the discussion of the Trump Tower project, but he was running for president by that point. Look, they got.
All of Russian funding.
Well, that's it.
Just
Right for president.
son of the
Look, we've had people say for years that Trump was running for president to make money or something like that. He was traveling.
What about the avoidance clause? All these people staying at his hotels and his resorts.
The emoluments clause, we've had a case about that that's been thrown out.
Only one that's been
Well,
thrown out, come on.
There's nothing
I
more.
understand.
District of New York.
Look,
So
look.
is this
Going out
New
on
York?
standing,
Oh,
which is,
if we could, I'm sorry, why don't we, if we could, let's sort of stay closer to the, because that, look, I understand. You got people have a lot of complaints about Trump. If Hillary Clinton had won, there would be people making complaints about Hillary. But as far as the point that I'm trying to make here, and I would say, by the way, this is important. This is a quote from the U.S. District Judge Dabney Friedrich, May 28th of this year. She ordered Mueller's people to stop overstating the evidence because they had been saying that this social media campaign was run by the Russian government. And she declared that the government shall refrain from making or authorizing any public statement that links the alleged conspiracy in the indictment to the Russian government. Willful failure to do so in the future will result in initiation of contempt proceedings. So what she's saying there is, at least in terms of anything that's been presented to her, there is no evidence that this social media campaign was actually being run by the government. Again, that fits in with my theory. I'm not saying they're good guys. I'm not saying they're not laying the groundwork to do bad things to America. But they were doing a marketing campaign to gather information so they could use it in the future to sell to organized crime, or maybe to give to the government. They wanted information on Americans. They wanted to learn as much as they could about politics, and this was their opportunity to do it, and that's why they ran those ads that were all over the place.
what you just said was wrong.
Okay.
That particular statement in that particular case
Right.
was about the fact that they had stated that there was no concrete evidence of conspiracy by the Russians with Trump. It did not say that the Russians didn't have any effect, that there was no evidence of them doing a media campaign.
No, I'm saying the government. And that's exactly what it was because
Read the whole paragraph.
Let's see, the Mueller had overstated the evidence. This is what she said, that Mueller had I'm paraphrasing, obviously, because that's what I have in front of me, and I apologize for that. But Mueller had overstated the evidence when he implied in his report to Congress, or when he implied in his report to Congress, that the trolls were controlled by the Russian government. I mean, it's the Internet Research Agency. They were doing what companies in this country do to our own people, or if they have an opportunity, do it in people in other countries.
Were they contracted? I mean, who paid them to do that? Wasn't the goodness of their heart, or they wanted to influence the
I think
election?
They were
it's
trying to-
entirely possible that the judge is just saying, we can't prove it.
That's
And
right.
if you can't prove it, then you shouldn't be making it
Kind of-
sound like
That's
you know.
exactly what she said.
Yeah, I
Yeah.
mean, there's a difference
And that's my
between
point.
proof in the court of law and common sense proof that would meet the standard for an intelligence assessment.
Look.
I mean, they're two different things,
Yeah.
obviously.
The point in the case is that there were some Russians who actually were accused, and Mueller assumed he could get away with his indictment without presenting evidence, and some actually showed up in court.
Well, what happened was they made a mistake because they indicted 13 Russian individuals who obviously are never going to be extradited, never going to come to the United States, can't be tried. Therefore, you could accuse them of anything and it'll never be adjudicated. And if the media do what they've been doing, which is they take an indictment, an accusation, and they report it as if it were found fact, then you're going to win. But he also, the Mueller team, indicted 3 companies, and that was an error. Because what that did was that allowed the companies to fight back through their lawyers, and now that's being adjudicated. And that's what this is about. If he hadn't done the 3 companies, they would have been in the clear. But because they indicted the companies as well as the individuals, and that was a mistake that I think several people noticed at the time.
You know, the other thing is, I will say is, okay, you say you're publishing a book, and I don't know how far you are in this process. But the reality is, unless you're, and again, I don't know who you're trying to, quote, sell the book to. But the reality is, for those of us who are actually trying to look at facts, to me, you've got to refute the other side's argument. It's not enough to say, here's my facts down the line, and I'm going to ignore these over here.
No.
I mean, you know, because obviously, it doesn't take a rocket science to feel that I'm sure I could get 20 other intelligent people to have their analysis saying why this was all appropriate, and the points you're making were beside the point. So I think you've got to respond to the people who are stating, this is why we proceeded. The other thing is, and this is true for both sides, people always assume things are conspiracy when it's just stupidity. And quite frankly, the Trump Tower thing in Russia is another example of complete stupidity. Anybody who knows anything about Russia is, people with money there don't want to build a building in Russia. They want to build it anywhere but Russia, because they want to get their money out of Russia. It's just like the Chinese want to get their money out of China. Again, this is not rocket scientists, but the stupidity of people who think, oh yeah, we're going to build this tower here or do something, just shows to me the level of complete incompetence. Because nobody in the right mind would know anything about anything, would think that Russian oligarchs are trying to park their money in Russia. They're trying to get it out of Russia. And so that whole thing was just, are you guys out of your mind? There's a whole series of things like that that are just replete in this entire analysis that anybody with an IQ above, never mind, very bad example given this crowd, but any event, it's just stupefying to see the level of complete incompetence, and that people always discount the level of incompetence that there is, including in the government, in the FBI, in the press, in Trump's campaign, in Clinton's campaign. And a lot of things people think are conspiracies are just people who were of minimal intelligence acting collectively as incompetence, and sinking to the lowest common denominator.
Well, I would say in general, I agree with what you said, and I hope I didn't come across as, look, look, sometimes a conspiracy is real. One time out of 100, Lincoln was killed by a conspiracy. But I think you're right. Most of the time, it's a confluence of factors. And I think in this, you do have to look at what I might call a semi-conspiracy, which is when people are in a bubble, they're surrounded by people who think just like them, and therefore they think they're coming to a logical conclusion that's based on the evidence when they're simply getting bounce back from all the people around them. And so people who thought that Trump was Satan were very quick to just assume that he must be a Russian spy and all these other things. Why? When Hillary's campaign, when they tried to penetrate Hillary's campaign, the Anna Chapman ring, remember those undercover agents? When they tried to penetrate Hillary's circle, they told Hillary and they stopped it. When this happened with Trump, they thought Carter Page might be being recruited by the Russians or whatever. They didn't go to Trump and tell him. They just assumed Trump was in on it. So they did all this by rules that were designed in a political campaign in America where the intelligence agencies aren't allowed to just assume that that presidential candidate is really a spy and therefore we can do anything we want to nail it.
Trump has a history of dealing with the Russian mafia.
Yeah, right.
He has an absolute written history of that.
Trump ran for president saying, I'm the guy who has paid off all the politicians all over the world. I paid off Hillary Clinton and Chuck Schumer. I paid off the New York real estate, the people who regulate real estate in New York. He said, I paid off all them. So elect me because I'm the guy who knows how to make the system work for you, little guy. That's what I'm just saying that's what he said.
He laundered money for them. That's different.
There was a question back here, I think.
Another question statement. The book you want written has already been written. It's called Russian Roulette by
that's David Corn.
David Corn.
And by the way, David Corn called me a useful idiot, so take that into account.
But are they seriously, what was that book written before or after the completion of the Mueller report?
Oh, that was written like more than a year ago. I'm sure they'll have a sequel. All the books that came out initially are having sequels.
Now, the Mueller report done, you would take all the evidence from inception. Yeah. Now, they do a report out, we have all the indictments done and all the prosecutions over with, and you would put that together and look at it.
But by the way, I would point out that the co-author of that book, Michael Isikoff, has said, well, maybe we went too far in accepting the Steele dossier. So he doesn't really defend the Steele dossier anymore. Yeah.
So what do you think about the way that the news and things bring this information to the public? Because obviously there's no way for them to know the complete truth, but I think a lot of the time they're not intentionally creating what is known today as like fake news. What do you think about the way that they more alter it and bias it using like loaded phrases and things like that? I mean, I think their intention is to take people from one side of the political divide and get them to their side. But would you say, I certainly think that, it basically just widens that divide using those loaded words and phrases?
The problem you have, in my view, in the news media, and I was a reporter, and I've been a reporter in one way or another for 46 years, and that is that you don't have a diversity of views in the major news media anymore. People who have different views keep their mouth shut because they know what's good for them, because people are so strident. And CNN used to be meticulously balanced. They would have their main show was Crossfire, where they would have one guy on the right and one guy on the left, and then they bring in a guest and put the guest between them, and they go back and forth. And they had people like Bob Novak, who was a sort of, by that point, a conservative. It started out as a liberal, but became a conservative, and they were all over that station. Now, I mean, ask people who work in newsrooms in Washington if they even know anybody who, heaven forbid, voted Republican or might have voted Republican or might, goodness gracious, support Trump. No. And so what happens?
Silos.
Well, yeah, exactly. It's just like in the intelligence community. That's why I was talking about handpicking the analysts. When you have people who all represent the same point of view, they're going to come to the conclusion. That's how you do rigging intelligence analysis. You don't tell them, I want you to reach this conclusion. You just pick out the analysts who you know are going to reach that conclusion. And that's what happens in the news media. And you end up with, really, Chris Cuomo and Don Lemon?
But you can, look, people in this room, I think, are capable, I would suspect, of listening to multiple viewpoints and drawing their own conclusion. Unfortunately, the Dunning-Kruger effect for a lot of people prevents them from ever getting out of their silo. So I don't know if that's the majority of people or not.
And look, people believe things about Hillary that are ridiculous. People believe things about Trump that are ridiculous. What I think the problem is now that people don't communicate with each other. You've heard all the things about Thanksgiving dinners and how they're ruined now because you have family members who are against each other. But that's what I was talking about before, about here. I mentioned some of these things to people this morning because I was literally bouncing it off people. Well, in other words, show me the flaw in my logic. And they just got incensed. The idea that Trump, he's a Nazi. Literally said he was a Nazi. And that he'd murdered people. And I heard that here this morning. And that's why I'm saying I don't know that I'll ever do a controversial, I've been doing this for years, but I don't know that I'll do it again because we've reached that point that people don't even have any respect for folks on the other side. And I hope I reflected, as much as I come to conclusions that you may disagree with, I hope I reflected that I want to hear what the other side is. First thing I did was I sat down with that David Korn, Michael Isikoff book, and I started going line by line, saying, well, is this? Do I want to refute this, or is this correct? Which is which? How would they respond if they were responding to my argument? That's what I try to do. Yeah.
The trouble with handling the news about how the news handles current events is the editor doesn't have to tell the reporter. The reporter already learned in journalism school, go out, get a headline.
As opposed to get the facts.
And make it a simple headline. Yeah. Make it a simple headline that will sell papers or magazines or TV shows. That's what they're after.
Since we're at a MENSA meeting, I can talk about this. The reporters that I have met in recent years, I think there's a decline in the quality of their intelligence, and by until I include being able to see the other side on any given issue. I just see dumb people in the media, incredibly. So yeah.
So the problem there isn't necessarily that they aren't intelligent. The problem is that the eye-catching headlines are the ones that make money. And the eye-catching headlines are also not necessarily the ones that are true. They're the ones that people have strong reactions. They're the ones that foster political animosity, which is causing the biggest issues.
Right.
Or that the product is outrage. Okay, Fox, you can't watch, Hannity or the other guy, but Maddow, come on. She smirks it almost as bad as Gutfeld. I don't know.
Well, and by the way, we're talking about the Russians. Often they will characterize what the Russians do as sowing division. Now, I happen to think most of the time, when the Russians get involved in political issues, they get involved with what they think is the side that's beneficial to them. So they're not necessarily fueling both sides, but they're fueling one side. And so you had a situation with Black Lives Matter that when the Russians were promoting these things, it was presented as, well, they're trying to get white supremacists mad or something, and that's why they're doing it. But when at the Democratic National Convention, they paid tribute to the Black Lives Matter movement, or when James Clapper gave a speech at Morehouse College about how great the Black Lives Matter movement was, well, okay, they're doing this and they're highlighting injustices in society. But if you had a Russian, something back by the Russians that said exactly the same thing, it would be characterized as they're sowing division and trying to get people to hate each other. And I think, so they're playing off of divisions.
That's what I pitch it to, baby.
They're playing off divisions, but I think the divisions are mainly here. And I think they're playing off existing.
The bottom line is, and I think this is discussed earlier today, is you have to have critical reasoning. It's the most important skill there
We
is.
don't teach that anymore.
Yeah, I mean, you can get it by osmosis. Critical thinking is something that has to be taught. I don't care what the subject is, even science. Yeah.
I'd like to ask you and anybody else in the room, if you think that Russian interference in our election is such a bad thing, what do you want to do about it?
Oh, that's the scary thing in my view, because look, the folks at Facebook faced a dilemma, which is it's a uniculture in Facebook, Google, and so on, all the Silicon Valley giants. They all believe the same thing. They all, at this point, hate Trump, et cetera, and that's fine. But they're common carriers. They were set up as people who would carry all points of view, like the phone company. The phone company doesn't say, oh my goodness, we need to listen in on your phone calls so we can decide if you're practicing hate speech and we can cut off your phone service. We would be outraged if they ever did that. And yet you have Silicon Valley trying to do that, and they're failing miserably in terms of making it logical and consistent. The group I used to work with had quoted Martin Luther King, and quoted Martin Luther King fairly. In other words, it reflected what he actually thought. And then that was taken down because it was, I don't know, somebody complained about it or something. And you see that all the time. They went after, at one point, Snopes, which is allied with the Silicon Valley companies, went after a site called Babylon Bee because they were saying that CNN had bought a washing machine so they could spin the news. Babylon Bee is like the Onion. And they were fact-checking the Babylon Bee and saying that's not literally true, and then trying to ban them off of some of the social media platforms. That's the level we've sunk to now. And I get that if somebody is threatening violence or something like that, but you've gotten to the point where, and Silicon Valley, they wanted to do that. They're embarrassed that the Trump campaign used Facebook to get elected. They're deeply ashamed, and they want to fix it, but what they're doing is basically censorship, and I know they're not governmental entities, but still it's censorship because they are common carriers. And they got their privileged legal position by saying we will carry all points of view, and now they don't do it.
They're not common carriers, and ISPs are not common carriers.
Well,
they are private corporations who can discriminate, okay, but they do not want to have censorship. Now,
oh, they want to have censorship. That's why they're setting it up the way they do.
The problem is that they have to, and it costs a lot of money to.
They have to. For example, the EU is putting pressure on them to do it, but under the Communications Decency Act, which is what this, and I was one of the plaintiffs to overturn the bad parts of that, the whole point is it sets you up as a common carrier, that is to say,
not legally,
that you are considered a person who carries the information from one side to the other. You are not a publisher, and that's what I mean by that. So, and someone's giving me a time signal. Someone's giving me a time signal. Anybody that hasn't asked a question or back there? Well, thank you very much. I appreciate it, and we'll see you around.